Week 9 of Cat 3C Futures Through Music Making. For these last 2 weeks of material, I want to look at film, to think about soundtracks, to think about the ways in which music is used in film, both within the world of the film itself and our experience as the audience, and how music plays around with our experience of the future. And in some ways, it ties back a lot of the ideas that we've covered in this class about in terms of signification, in terms of making reference to the now versus what's in the future. And I think that hopefully after you watch this, it'll kind of give you a little bit more kind of cues in the way in which music is kind of, grabbing a hold of your senses and the real power that it has whenever you're watching, film, whenever you're watching science fiction, TV shows, anything of the sort. So for us to get into this discussion, we need to kind of lay out some very important terms. I'm going to start with this one right here, and this is a really important one, diegetic. What does diegetic mean, or what is the diegesis? Well, the diegesis is essentially the world of the film itself, the things that occur within that world. So, for instance, on the left here, we have this picture of Jean-Luc Picard playing this kind of piccolo flute-like instrument, right? And for those of you who might be Trekkies, I know you're out there, well, that is diegetic music. Picard is hearing that music. The people in the room with Picard are hearing that music, right? It is of the world of the film. And one way of thinking about the way in which diegetic music works is that it's supposed to imply what are the musical practices, right? Or as I say here, the musical cultural practices of the film's time and location. What is it saying about that particular moment in time and what's important? I think this Picard example is kind of interesting to think about because in some ways, he's not playing an electronic instrument. He's not playing a virtual instrument. In a sense, it's almost, I would argue, supposed to kind of be like this older form, right? Something maybe anachronistic, something that might be outdated in itself. And that is supposed to make a comment on Picard, right? That Picard is this kind of worldly character, that he appreciates history, that he appreciates tradition in some sort of way, right? And that, of course, makes him this admirable character in a lot of ways. Well, regardless, that is diegetic music. Now, the opposite would be non-diegetic music. This is the music outside of the world. It is our world, in a sense. So this is what the audience hears, not what the characters in, the film in the world, or in the film world here at all. And the big difference here when we think about musical cultural practices, in a lot of ways, it's referring to our moments. It's referring to our understanding of what music is, of what sound is, how all of these things relate. And, so this is kind of important to remember that film music is always kind of playing with this. There have been a lot of examples of, and I'm going to explain one here in a second, of that moment in which diegetic music becomes non-diegetic. In other words, how do you go from kind of experiencing the sound world within the film to all of a sudden now being taken out of that, crossing that, as I say, that fourth wall, to remind the audience who they are, in a sense, that we are watching this thing, and that music becomes non-diegetic. Well, the example I want to talk about in that case is from the 1980s film Terminator. Maybe you've seen it, and I'm not talking about all of the sequels and the TV shows and all that stuff. I'm talking about the original James Cameron classic, back when Arnold Schwarzenegger was not the governor of California, when he was known more for being a weightlifter. for being this kind of world-renowned bodybuilder. And I've actually seen Terminator referred to actually as a horror film because there's no comedy to it. There's nothing lighthearted. It is a dark film through and through, right? Well, there's one scene that I think is fantastic for a number of reasons. And it's this moment in which Sarah Connor, who's one of the protagonists of the film, she is being chased. And she ends up in this bar called Tech Noir, which in and of itself is fantastic. You know, on one hand, referring obviously to technology and, you know, thinking about it as this cutting edge thing. And then noir, in a lot of ways, alluding to film noir, and in a lot of ways referring to kind of dark, darkly themed movies from the 1950s, the 1960s. And so it's already kind of playing with this idea already. Well, anyways, as you watch this scene, I want you to notice how, at first, we are in the club with Sarah Connor. We hear everything within the club going on. And this is very kind of like 1980s-esque dance music. I wouldn't even necessarily call it techno or anything like that, because techno is very much an underground thing. This is more just kind of like a synth pop in a lot of ways. Well, anyways, so Sarah Connor, she's, you know, talking on the phone, and then if you listen carefully, all of a sudden the diegetic music starts to become diffuse. In other words, what they do is they apply a lot of reverb, that kind of echoey sound. And what reverb does in a certain level is it distances things. It makes them seem farther away. And in some ways, it's supposed to reflect Sarah Connor, that she's no longer focused on the sound of that moment. But I think it's also at that moment that the film world music, that dance club music, all of a sudden now starts to take on non-diegetic qualities. That distancing kind of smears out time. And you notice everything starts to move in slow motion as well. And we start to hear these other sounds start to rise up that are definitely non-diegetic. And those sounds are building. And so in a sense, we've crossed from diegetic music into non-diegetic music. And then, of course, you know, once the Terminator, once Arnold Schwarzenegger sees Sarah Connor and he starts to shoot everybody up, all that sound, all that non-diegetic music and diegetic music, it actually all kind of stops. And it's supposed to be that stark shock of silence in a way. So whenever you're watching a TV show, whenever you're watching film, you know, it's always kind of a good reminder, okay, what is the diegetic music here? What is the non-diegetic music here? And this is going to be kind of an important idea for us to think about for these next 2 weeks of content, because it's always in that play of diegesis and non-diegesis that we are presented with the familiar, and we're also presented with the alien, the the extraterrestrial, if you will.